Well, joining me here in the studio to discuss that story in a little more detail is the political analyst Dan Hamilton. Dan, thanks very much for joining us. Now, my first question would be that one of the main conditions of the ceasefire was that both sides were supposed to withdraw their heavy weapons from the front line, and obviously that doesn't appear to be happening. So, well, first of all, do you think it's likely to happen at any point?
I don't. I mean, right from the start of this conflict, Russia has proved itself to be utterly insincere in every single promise it's made. You forget this is actually the third iteration of any ceasefire that we've seen in the region. Every single time promises have been made by Moscow that they'll pull back from the front line, that they will stop advancing into Ukrainian territory. They haven't kept a single one of those promises, and there's no reason to expect at this juncture that they'll keep them now.
So do you think this shelling's just going to go on and on indefinitely?
I think there's an absolute plan in Moscow to continue this war as long as is possible in order to keep advancing into Ukrainian sovereign territory. As we've seen over the last few days, there's been various comments that have been made by the supposed rebel leaders who have been provided with significant weapons and armaments directly from the Russian army as they continue to travel forward towards the city of Kharkiv, towards entrenching their positions which they have in towns like Debaltseve as well. So there's no sincerity on their part. This is a war without any end at present.
I mean, that's a very bleak picture that you're painting there. Russia is obviously key to all of this. It needs to use its influence in order to try and stop those rebels from holding weapons. But are the Russians actually likely to do anything to get the rebels to withdraw their artillery, do you think?
Well, I think there's a fundamental confusion here when we talk about Russia and we talk about rebels. The rebels are fundamentally part of the same movement. These are people who've been provided with tanks, with guns, with weapons, directly from the Russian army. So
when you say the same movement, well, I mean, there are plenty of wars that occur all over the world where one lot are doing the fighting and others, of course, are giving them weapons, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're one and the same. The Russians, of course, deny that they're one and the same as the rebels.
Well, I think that's fundamentally been disproved by all international evidence so far. If you look at the weapons, you look at the tanks, you look at the type of munitions that have found their way into the hands of rebels, there's only one place they could have come from, which is directly from Russian military munitions. Fundamentally, if you look at the last few years and you look at the conflicts that Russia has been engaged in recent years, from the illegal invasion of Georgia and the provinces of Abkhazia and South Ossetia in 2008, all the way onto Crimea, all the way onto the Donbass region in this present day, there is evidence that exists to suggest that those rebel forces on the ground have direct coordination with the Russian army. And regrettably, that's exactly the same case when it comes to what's going on in eastern Ukraine at the moment.
OK, well, let's say that they do have coordination, as you say. The question is, how much pressure can the Russians actually put on these rebels? For example, if the Russians do ask them, withdraw your artillery, withdraw other heavy weapons, are they likely to actually pay any attention to the Russians?
Russia is the lifeblood of this particular movement. The funding, the monies, the weapons are directly streaming across the eastern border of Ukraine. Vladimir Putin has in his power the ability to shut down this shelling, to shut down these incursions into East Ukraine with the sweep of a pen and a few words to those rebel forces on the ground. Unfortunately, with the fact that the West and the fact that Western forces did not take on Putin when it came to the invasion of Georgia, when it came to the invasion of Crimea, has further emboldened Putin to go even further into eastern Ukraine. And unfortunately, he's shown no sincerity in terms of pulling back.
OK, well, how do you see this situation playing out from here, then?
I think the only real option we've got, if we wish to see peace in the region, is for the West to play a far more engaged role than it has to date. Unfortunately, the actions that Germany have undertaken have not been sufficient. They've not put significant enough pressure upon the Russian government, partly because of the significant business interests in terms of the energy sector that Germany enjoys in its relations with Russia. What we need to do is actually to see some far more involvement here from the United States, from NATO, from the United Kingdom, to actually send significant aid, significant munitions to the Ukrainian government so that they can actually fight on a level playing field with Russia, because at the moment it's an entirely one-sided conflict.
Well, thank you very much for joining us, political analyst Dan Hamilton.